Are we on? We good? Cool. So I realized how close you are to lunch, and it is so hot in here. So I'm going to try to be as quick as I can. My talk's kind of long. It was like 3 hours, actually. I've had to cut it down as much as I can because there's a lot to talk about. Design for developers, developers for design, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, let's get into it. I want to do a quick roll call. So here as the main definition of your job is a developer. Hands up high. So it's like pretty much the whole room, not surprising. Hands up if you're a designer as your main job. 0. I'm glad I didn't organize after like drinks afterwards for just designers because that's kind of like very lonely. How about product managers? Oh, we got 2 product managers. Okay, well, sort of up there, and then something else. Does anyone have cool? We have a few people here who their main job is inside product. That's really cool. It's cool you guys could come to this conference. So my talk is called Designing with Elm. My name's Jono. You can find me at Jono Mallanyk on Twitter or jono.co. It's my website if you want just links to my social or whatever. I've been a product designer for about 15 years. This is my first ever Elm conference, not just speaking, but attending, which is amazing. And the fact that, you welcome in designers says a lot about this like Elm community, and it's a lot of what's made me so intrigued about Elm. So I want to kind of dive in and talk about why I'm here. And the main reason is that Elm was the breakthrough programming language for me. And what I mean by that is I spent my whole career trying to learn code. I've been a professional product designer for about 15 years, and to me, like, I wanted to get good at code, and by that I meant productive. And I've never been able to find that, and I'll go into why. I've always had a deep interest in code, and I've been around code. I've always worked on digital products. I'm a big believer that we can reach new heights in our work when designers understand development and developers understand design. So I'm going to talk about my experience learning Elm as a designer, and then how Elm impacted my design and product management process. So a few goals for my talk. So number 1, I want more designers discovering Elm, especially designers who've tried programming but have not had a good experience. And that has been my experience with a lot of different languages. I really think it's important for designers to be able to work on the real thing. The problem with design tools is it's all static. It's an image or a picture of a design and not the actual application that ends up in a user's hands. And of course, I'd love to see more designers in the Elm community. Hopefully, maybe in a future Elm Europe, if I ask how many designers we could have something like near half the room. That'd be amazing. I also want to talk about ways to improve product team collaboration. I think it's amazing how much work we get done, considering that we don't speak the same language across all the different roles. We have different tools, we prioritize in different ways, and so I want to talk about how I'm using Elm for that. And then lastly, I want more people being able to make their own tools. It's so empowering to be able to make your own things. I'm jealous of the sheer amount of tooling that developers have. And it makes sense. You guys are the ones that make the tools, but you have a tool for everything. You have a framework for every developer in the room. You could have your own JavaScript framework at this point. It's true. And we need more diversity and more perspective. Even design itself is really centered around 3 or 4 main tools. So I think, as a general rule, if it's your first Elm talk, you kind of have to tell everyone how you found Elm. It seems to be just the way it works. So for me, HTML and CSS in sort of late 90s, early 2000s, some JavaScript and ActionScript thanks to Flash. That was a terrible time. I learned Ruby, a little bit of Ruby, and mostly just ERB stuff when I became the lead designer of a startup. And through that, I got to learn Git, which was a big leg up. I tried React in 2015, and then I found Elixir, and I was like, what is this functional programming thing? Played around with Elixir a bit, and then I sort of landed on Elm. And so I want to talk about some of the roadblocks I had learning other languages, and they're kind of language agnostic roadblocks, although I kind of, especially blame JavaScript for a lot of my challenges learning, and then I want to go into why Elm solved those things. So roadblock number 1, I was always looking for the perfect syntax, perfect formatting, and just a way to organize code that made sense to me. And I'd spend a long time looking for, okay, here's a syntax that seems to fit my mental model of what an application should be. And then I'd play around forever with formatting. I would sort of like get into my editor and think, oh, this is the way the language looks good to me. And if I couldn't figure it out, I'd try to read online. If you ever want to have a hard time or a bad time, go and read people arguing about how code should be formatted. And I think we've all had this even within our own teams, developers sort of arguing this is the way we should format code. And also just organization. I found it difficult to know how do I organize my code. Roadblock number 2, I finished a tutorial now, and now what? So most tutorials are not written for designers. That already puts us a step behind. But after we get there, it's sort of like, okay, I can copy a tutorial and I sort of understand the syntax, but now how do I go and do something practical? And the advice is always, just go build something. Just build a tool. And it's sort of like that meme. It's like, draw 2 circles and then just draw the owl. I feel like that just doesn't really connect. So roadblock number 3, which framework do I use? That's a scary thing in so many languages. There are so many options and everyone has pros and cons, so it makes it pretty hard to learn. I never got momentum when working. And so, as an example, small mistakes would cost me a lot of mental power and a lot of time. So, I might save some sort of JavaScript I'm working on, and then, my code editor's like, cool, you saved it, and then you go check it, and something's not working, and you spend hours thinking it's something complex, then you find out it's because of like a misspelled function name or a missing semicolon. So I just kind of never felt like I was productive. Changes are really hard, and everything breaks whenever I was making changes. And I also had like a low maximum application complexity threshold. So once an application got above, like 600-700 lines, I'd start to sort of lose like how to track where changes became. And so once I'd get to a couple of thousand, I'd just be completely lost. Roadblock number 5, reading other people's code felt impossible. So, unless a repo lets you download someone's mind, you can't really figure out how to navigate someone else's code unless it follows a certain pattern. I don't think we often think of our code as a user interface. The user interface needs navigation and it needs wayfinding. It seemed to me that the priority is often typing speed over readability for the way most people were writing their code. And so, there's some of the roadblocks. And the funny thing is, lots of developers probably have similar challenges to this. But for me as a designer, I didn't know that. I'm sort of on the outside, and I'm just assuming all these people kind of get this, and for some reason it's not connected with my brain. And I had no one to tell me that. But Elm changed this. And so I want to talk about a couple of reasons why it's been different. And hopefully this connects with people. Either you work with a designer or other designers out there find this, and hopefully it encourages them. So the first thing it gave me was a model for thinking. And this is really interesting. I never knew I needed to find this. I was always like, I got to understand the syntax. I got to understand the way it should be organized. But in actual reality, what I needed was a mental model. This is how you think about code. And so a great example of that is like the question, what do I do next, or where do I start? And I've just heard this advice, like just start with the model or start with a type signature for a function. And that to me has just been amazing. Like even just designing out a type signature is this great little exercise of this is what I think it's going to be. And that's just helped me like understand now how I write the code in order to do that. And that's never something I had before in a different language. Applications scale with the same techniques you learn for small programs. So you can sort of understand a bigger program if you understand how a small program in Elm works, which I think is amazing. Everyone's code follows the same architecture, so you have a path to deciphering it. So even something as big and complex as the Elm SPA, which I've learned so much from reading that code base, thanks Richard, I was sort of able to navigate it. And now for me, in order to learn how an SPA worked, I still had to like strip out a lot of the business logic that was in that in order to get my head around exactly how that functioned, splitting up modules and all that stuff. But I was able to do that. And any other language, I wouldn't have been able to just rip out all that code and be confident that I could still understand it. And I get momentum through letting the compiler catch all my little mistakes. So that lets me stay focused on the core thing I'm trying to build instead of just correcting all my mistakes all the time. So principle number 2, confidence, consistency, and constraints. There's only one way to organize, and that's the Elm architecture. There's only one way to format code style, which is Elm format, and I still fell into the same trap I've always fell in when I found Elm format. When I first saw the like 4 space tabs for everything, I was like, whoa, I can't do that. And so I forked Elm format and I changed it to 2, the thing you should not do. It's embarrassing. And then I was like, wait, I'm doing the same stuff I've always done. And so I was like, let me go with how Elm format normally works. And then, now that I've done it, whenever I see code that's just like tabbed by 2 spaces, I think it looks so cramped and I can't read it. So I'm glad I actually stuck with it. Slightly embarrassing though. I love this idea that you can make a change anywhere and let the compiler walk you through the rest. I mean, I wish life just worked that way. And then, there's no configuration options, so I can't sit in there and try to make it better when I have no idea what I'm doing. And so it's the same for anyone. You can't opt out of the things that make Elm great. And so when other languages start to pick up things like, add immutability or whatever, it's still something someone can opt out of. And so lastly, you can just dive in head first. So as a designer, static views are almost one-to-one mapping that HTML. So this idea that like designers might not even be able to get their head around view code is just not true. It looks exactly like HTML. There's just some small differences. Designers can get their head around that. So technically, as a designer, if you're coming into Elm, you know a little bit of Elm already. You can start there and sort of understand how the views work. My early programs just had handwritten like records as my models in Elm until I sort of got the hang of it. I didn't think about how do I talk to a server or anything like that. I kind of stepped forward and added, now I'm using a local JSON file, so I don't need to worry about erroring. And then eventually I sort of added things like HTTP and all that stuff. Each edition adds a layer of complexity. And so for me, just sort of like stepping piece by piece through it really helped me get my head around it. I started to gain momentum around, learning how to code. And so I also didn't write any CSS when I'd be building little tools out with Elm, so I could just focus on writing Elm itself. Instead, I used a functional CSS library called base CSS. It has small composable utility classes with no side effects, so it kind of fits nicely with the way Elm works. It's fantastic, by the way. You should check it out. And so now I want to talk about how Elm changed the way I approach design work. So it's not just impacted me as a developer now, it's also changed the way I think about design and product management. And so there are kind of two areas that it does that in. It's in my design tooling and what I want out of my future design tooling, and also in a process I use that I'm going to walk through. So I believe being more proficient in code makes me a more effective designer. I get to work on the real thing that users use. This is important to get a feel for the actual design and whether it's working. I don't think you can get it in static images of a design. There are also design decisions that only reveal themselves in code. It's typically the states between the main states that you design. There are just things you don't see and don't understand until you've seen it in code and see it working, and you can kind of understand how to design well for it. But that's sort of programming in general. I want to talk about what Elm has specifically changed for me. And so, I guess sort of an analogy, Richard gave a talk a couple of years back, I guess, called Make the Backend Team Jealous. And I've sort of found myself, as I've been splitting my time between writing Elm and doing my regular design and sort of product management work, I found I've started to make myself jealous. I'd be in Elm and I just have this great making experience, and then I'd dive into my other tools and I hit save and I'd be like, okay, you don't get any feedback. And it's fascinating to me just how much it's just this incredible user experience for a tool. And so I only have a very short amount of time to quickly show a couple of demos. This here is it almost fits on screen. This here is like a little markdown parser, which I wrote an extension on top of. And so I started exploring this idea of declarative design tools. So tools that let a machine render the work rather than the designer themselves kind of drawing everything. And so this is an example, just a really quick, short, silly one. This is like a sign-up form, and you've got regular markdown, so you can just create a regular document, but within it you've got this extra syntax for creating UI elements, and then they actually work as well, which is interesting. And so then we're adding a button here, we can kind of hit render again, and then it kind of adds sign up. And there's something really interesting to me about kind of working in this way. So I've started exploring little ideas around this. I've also kind of created a GUI version of this that lets you just kind of straight up create those elements and kind of connect pages together. I want to show you something that Elm's really inspired. Is this actually playing automatically? No, it's a diff. Did it change? There we go. Okay. So this is sort of fitting into a thesis I have in my design work, in that I believe the future of all work is compiled. I think there will always be a compiler step in the way we work, and machines will do more and more of our work for us. So this here is sort of a slightly more complex example, but I wanted to show me sort of stealing from Elm and the user experience of Elm that I wanted in design tools. So this is the same kind of thing, just sort of a little bit more complicated. But I try to click on the sign up button there and it doesn't work. And well, a design tool typically doesn't cover any of that, but instead what we've got here, maybe I should pause it there, is built-in, did not pause, and I skipped the slide. That's awesome. We're not going to finish watching that, but what I built in is a tool that sort of understands that you haven't made certain design considerations when you make a UI, and so in that case, the button didn't link anywhere. Now a designer can deliver you a static file, and it's there are all these little things that aren't considered. Well, in this case, it calls you out and says, you need to add a link here before you can consider this ship. So that's sort of me exploring getting a debugging-like experience that's similar to Elm. Now I will skip forward. Okay, cool. And so I want to talk a little bit about process now and how Elm's inspired my design process. And maybe this is something you can actually take away and use with your teams if you think it's interesting. So the question, what is the central organizing system your team uses to think and talk about your product? And so I mean across the entire product team. It's about team alignment about what you're building. Another way to put it is, what is your product team's single source of truth? Most product teams don't have one, or it becomes out of date pretty quickly. The truth is spread out in people's minds across wikis, sketches, high-fidelity designs, communication tools, and inside code. So I have been exploring something new after sort of understanding how Elm kind of does such a good job in the way it captures all the considerations when you're building a product. I started using types, models, and messages long before we get into code up front with the product team. So we're using it to sort of think about what our product needs to be and kind of create a master list of everything that needs to be done. So it's inspired by the Elm architecture, and I've been organizing and aligning product design, engineering work in a new way. And it's not inside an Elm module. We do it inside some kind of shared document. It's kind of like Elm pseudocode. The goal is to enable design and development to start work at the same time, which is a big problem with a regular kind of process we follow. And so the idea that they can both start their work at the same time, but also have the confidence that both teams are heading in the same direction. The specific focus here is on how teams define the functional requirements of an application where I think the highest leverage work is. So this is going to feel very familiar to all the Elm programmers in here, which seems like it's pretty much everybody. But there's something really powerful about working and thinking in this way with a whole product team instead of just in code. So it's a work in progress, but I figured I'd share it. So we're going to do a quick example exercise. So we're all a product team together, which should be way too big, but that's fine. And so, we have an application that we are thinking about, and it's used to manage restaurants and bars. And we've identified a new problem with our customers. Our customers sometimes rent out their venue for different events, and they need a way to manage bookings, and they've been doing it in Excel or whatever it is right now. And so, we can quickly understand what the users need. We need to capture the name of who's booking it, the date, maybe the price, and then some kind of booking status for the event. We need a list of events, some events details of some kind, and then a form for adding new events or editing an event. So this is the way the process would typically work on most teams I've ever worked with, and I'm sure you'll have something similar. So the PM gathers those requirements. The designer then creates happy path UI design. So here's like the 3 main screens that we talked about. And then what we do is we pass that down the line. Maybe the whole team comes together. We scope the work and we prioritize the work. So, we understand we got these 3 screens. Here's the amount of work we think it's going to take. And then we go and sort of like organize that into some kind of user stories, and then the developers start building. Most teams follow a process like this. The earlier the stage, the cheaper and faster iteration is. That's the reason why we kind of pass work down the line, because it's kind of easy to make requirements and it's slightly less easy to make designs, and it gets more complex to actually build the thing. And so the reason we do that is we try to lock down definitions before we begin work at the next stage. This process is not ideal. Each stage in the process keeps the rest of the team on hold, so you're not working while you're waiting to receive work. I think as designers and the whole team, in fact, we need to see something in action before we can judge the quality of a design. Scoping from a happy path means we miss all the other states that a user can get into, and this is the reason teams are always late with their work, is that we scoped against what we thought we needed to do versus reality. And there is not a good process for introducing change as the team learns. Our work cannot influence the step before it. So because we lack a common starting point, we rely on all these upfront decisions to narrow our focus. So as I mentioned, this is the process I've been exploring with. I define a domain with my team, or even when I'm just working on my own now, I define the domain first with types and models, and I do this outside of Elm. And then I also think about the different interactions, and that's sort of captured like messages. And so when I'm writing Elm, the compiler catches me if I miss something. The compiler can do this because it knows about the domain and our concerns. We define them within the application. The more I used Elm, the more I wanted a way to organize the rest of my work in a similar fashion. By using types, models, and messages to define our domain and plan our work, we have a list we can use to make sure our UI designs and delivered software meet all our requirements. This process allows our team to start with more in-depth coverage of a feature scope. Designers and developers can start work at the same time, confident they are both heading in the same direction, and constantly come back and relay their changing understanding for the totality of the solution. So it might be a bit abstract, this idea. We'll go through a very quick sort of demo exercise. So you'll see this is kind of like Elm-ish pseudocode. It looks a lot like Elm. It's just enough for us to define the things that we care about when we're trying to create a design and understand the functional requirements of a design. It doesn't have to have a strict mapping to Elm at all. You don't even have to use Elm while you do this. So we have our event type up there, name, date, price, status. And we also know that we need a special status type, so we want to capture that there and make sure that's in the considerations. So the thing about starting with this is we know that if we're designing or building something around an event, no design files and no code should ever not include all of the considerations that are built around an event. Next, we model our data out. What data does a user need? I think this is such an important step in the design process, and very few designers do this. It's like, think about the model, think about the data that goes in before you start drawing the interface it fits in. To me, it's data first, model out the data, understand the changes, and then you create a user interface around it. And so, we acknowledged earlier that we needed an events list, which will take a list of events. We need an event detail screen, which will take an event, and then we need an event form, which takes the pieces of an event. And so, all right, we now understand the pages, but now we also combine that with a list of messages. And I'm using messages here to sub in for what are the interactions a user will need to perform while they're working their way through our application. And we don't expect this to be a complete list when we do this. It's just as much as we think is the right direction. And the goal here, you'll see we've got things for loading data, handling error and success states, all the actions we expect the user to perform, all the stuff that is never covered in the typical design process, or UI design, that is. All of this stuff gets defined before we make any designs and before we start writing code. And I'll show you why there's value in this, is that a typical UI design process covers the 3 states that we mentioned, those 3 screens, and it's all like the perfect state with the perfect amount of data and information, all that kind of thing. So instead, if we map out from our defined model types and messages, along with calling early attention to things like form validation and remote data, our feature is actually made up of about 14 states, and maybe many more as well. At this point, everyone can begin their work with a shared equal definition of what a feature is going to be. So as a developer, you can start kind of building out the feature before you receive any form of UI design, just using sort of basic web components. And as a designer, I can also start knowing that once I'm ready to show the design to the developer, both of the work we've done so far is going to look pretty similar, and they're going to connect pretty easily. Even a PM could take this list, not exactly in this form, but take it out and sort of like go out and have that conversation with customers and make sure we're capturing all the data we need to do the job properly. I'm wrapping up. And so the important thing here is to keep this as the source of truth. So we create the model, the messages, and the types. And we now use this as our source of truth the entire time we're working on the product, even post-launch. And includes all our changes. It's the kind of thing where you don't necessarily need to mock up all of those things as a designer. If you have a design system in place, you'll kind of know, okay, this is what a loading state looks like, but at least it makes sure that the whole team has those considerations. Inevitably, the design files get out of date anyway, so you don't really need to keep updating them once there are real views that can be worked on. And so what I've been getting out of this is extracting the tools we have for organizing our thinking in Elm and using them for the whole product team gives us a foundation and a shared language that everybody can work from. And so, I've been spending a bunch of time last sort of year or so really thinking about, or rethinking the way design works, both from a tooling perspective and a process perspective. And Elm's been a huge inspiration for me for that. And so, if you're interested in similar ideas or if anyone's tried anything like this at their work, I'd love to hear, have conversations. I think this is also a fascinating intro to Elm too. If you start working with the designers to understand how models and messages work, regardless of actually learning Elm as a language. Cool. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
So, any questions?
Thanks for a great talk. You mentioned the Elm tutorial. Were there any other resources you found particularly useful for designers that you would suggest to any designers picking this up?
Yeah, great question. I watched everything Richard had made. It's ridiculous how much content that guy creates. I don't really quite know how you do it. It's amazing. Particularly, he had a course on front-end masters, which was really, really useful for me. I did both the beginners and then I did the advanced, and there were definitely some things that didn't stick when I came across it, but that helped me a ton. I'm trying to think what else. There's a guy named Alex Corbin, I think is his name. Is that right? Yeah, he's been super helpful. Like everything on there. I also bought Elm in Action like when it was first available, and so I've been following along as that's been updated. And it's awesome that it's finished because I'm excited to see what the end is. But yeah, so that's pretty much. And the other thing actually that helped me a ton was ThoughtBot. The ridiculous amount of stuff they put out. Joel works there. The Bike Shed, their podcast, just listening to people talk about Elm helped me learn like what the concerns should be. So that was massive. And then they have a ton of content around like product types and a bunch of other things that's been super inspirational for me.
Yes. Have you persuaded some of your designer colleagues to use the same process?
I have, yeah. It's been a little slow going, but that's because I think a lot of designers who are even interested in code at all have been burned in the past by like kind of learning this stuff. And then there are other designers who just flat out believe that like you don't need to learn code as a designer, which is totally fine. There's that annoying debate, should designers code? It's like, yes, if you want to, you should. But the problem is for most people, they have had that experience that just wasn't that fun. But yeah, I've seen change both across, I've had to convince development teams to use Elm as well, but I've been doing that, and all the companies I've been working with are like picking it up because I'm like, I can contribute to this. Like, you know, it's like having an extra engineer for free, right? And so, yeah, it's been a big thing. Yeah. Anything else? Cool. Well, come talk to me after. I'd love to hear any design-related stories you have or whatever it is. Cool. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jono.